Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the final day of Orkney International Science Festival. I hope you've enjoyed all of the events so far. This morning, I am delighted to be hosting the talk on recycling ocean plastic. According to recent research, 8 to 10 million tons of plastic end up in the ocean each year, and this adds to hundreds of millions more tons, which are already floating in our oceans, damaging both the environment and marine life. And one approach to dealing with this issue, which we'll hear about from our speaker today, Dr. Katharina Vones, is from the Royal College of Art, is to harvest this plastic and turn it into something useful. Um, she is joining us today to describe a tabletop scale process which can be adopted at home for turning waste plastic into filament for 3D printing, giving that waste plastic a new life. To introduce our speaker today, Dr. Katharina Vones is a senior lecturer in jewelry and metal at the Royal College of Art. She has studied at St Andrews University, the Edinburgh College of Art, Royal College of Art, and University of Dundee. Her research interests currently include sustainable craft practices centered on the use of novel materials, and she has created a community to encourage participation in open and sustainable craft practices. And I will now pass you on to her.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming today and listening to my talk. I started this project together with my co-investigator Ian Lambert in 2018. And since then, the plastics problem in the oceans has, if anything, got a lot worse. I brought some samples here that you can see on the stage, and we can examine a little bit more closely later in the green room. But these I just picked up over the last few days since arriving in Orkney from two local beaches that I visited. So it's right on your doorstep, and I'm sure a lot of you are aware of all the plastics that are being swept up. Ian and me started this project. Ian visited on the Outer Hebrides. Ian visited the Outer Hebrides and especially the Isle of Harris in 2016, I think, with another researcher taking note of oral histories in Scotland. And while he was there, he saw this beach on a small island just off the coast of Harris and called Scarp. And I'll be showing you a little map of that in a minute. And he was taken aback by how much plastics he could see there. It was, again, you will see the pictures. It is just a plastics landscape. And I haven't seen anything like that in my time in Orkney so far. The problem here seems to be a lot more dispersed. But then I haven't visited any of the less inhabited islands around here. So if you've seen any islands that are very, very much inundated with plastics, please tell me. I'd be very interested. So that's Ian and me here on Harris at a beach, about to start collecting some plastics. And the aim of the project really wasn't to solve this massive, massive problem. I think you've all seen pictures of the Pacific garbage patch, a lot of plastics floating around in the sea, where these gyres meet, making massive islands of plastics almost. That's not what this project was trying to solve because these massive problems are too big to solve for one person. And you've seen images like these, I'm sure. Hopefully not in real life, that I don't know. But the plastics gets everywhere. Messages of doom on the news every day about microplastics entering the brain now through our bloodstreams. So we have become a little bit made out of plastic ourselves. So this is a drawing that Ian did of Scarp up here. That's Scarp. So this was our main focus for the project and for collecting plastics. We were staying down here, actually a little bit further down here, when we visited. And in fact, we visited a lot of beaches around Harris, and none of the other beaches immediately showed the same amounts of plastics. And we speculate that's because a lot of the plastic gets swept up from the ocean, and then it just gets landed on the beaches of Scarp around this area here. And there used to be a settlement. This used to be an inhabited island until the 70s, and I think now only a very few residents remain, and they mostly leave the island in the winter. It's also quite a hard island to get to. You can just come from this little port here via a fishing boat to here where the pier is, and then you have to hike over a set of mountains to the beaches. So it's very far from accessible, and I think this is what's made the plastics problem all the worse. I'm sure I've heard already from locals that there's big collections that are being organized, beach cleanups on Orkney, and in fact on the Isle of Harrods is the same. But then once you pick the plastics up and you gather it in these big sacks, how do you get it away from a remote location like this? When you come up to these bays, and this is actually on the Isle of Scarp, just coming down to one of the main beaches that we investigated, you can't see the plastics. It looks like a very beautiful beach, very idyllic location. But as you get closer, you get little hints of plastics having been swept up as far as nearly the top of the hills by storms in the winter and in the spring and in the autumn. And you just think it's beautiful, but this a few bits of plastics are floating around. It raises a lot of questions. For instance, like when does one bit of plastic become an ocean plastic problem? When is it litter and when is it a massive plastics issue? So this is what you see when you get down to the beach. And it isn't that unlike what I saw here on Orkney, just there's a lot more of it. You can see the sheer scale of the plastics, and maybe you have seen this after a very bad storm that's maybe hit your island, and the rocks start to cover the plastics, and you have to start digging for it almost. So this is just what's on the surface. Underneath these rocks and pebbles, there's another layer of plastics that gets added to every year. And this is just another view. You can see here a collection has taken place by local enthusiasts, and they have gathered all the plastics that they found at that point into these big rubbish bags. But the only way to get them off this island is then to use local fishermen who may or may not be willing to do that, or who might not even have the time to do that, or the boats, because all this beach here is just pebbles as far as the eye can see, and I think the boats can only harbor more here, so they can't get really close to the plastics. So it's a humongous effort on a large scale. When we went, our mission was mainly to collect plastic samples to see what kinds of plastics are out there, what can you do with them, how long have they been there, and what might they look like if you look at them through a magnification lens. And so I could never imagine so much plastic in one place. I have to say, I'm still very shocked when I see these images. Even though I was there, it's hard to believe. I'm sure it has got even worse over the years. And you can actually also see from these images that the stuff we found isn't that unlike what I found here on Orkney. You've got the buoys. They just come loose when storms hit, wherever they're tied up, and then they float to the beach. They're possibly one of the hardest and easiest problems of the ocean plastic finds, because in some ways you can reuse them, and local fishermen do. They just pick them up, especially the ones that aren't broken up, and reuse them for their own practice. But they're also very hard if they're not whole anymore, if they're not reusable in that way. They're very hard to do anything with because of the type of plastic that they're mostly made of, which is polystyrene. And I'll talk about that a little bit later again as well. Another thing that you've probably seen quite a lot of as well on your beaches are fishing crates and ropes, large amounts of ropes, just pieces of ropes. Again, those get mm, just separated from whatever vessel they've maybe been on or whatever fishing that they have been a part of through storms, and sometimes they're just cut out. More interesting are the little bits of mysterious objects that you might find, such as this rather beautiful little thing, this is maybe where our human mind starts to wonder, what did these objects used to be? What was their past and what could be their future? And I know quite a few practitioners in Scotland are now using beautiful pieces of ocean plastics that they find in things like in their own jewelry practice, for instance, to make new pieces. And that's a wonderful approach. I think that's a really nice way to make use of something that already exists. But what do we do with the fragments like these or the ropes that are not usable anymore? So we started up here on Scarp, and then we drove all the way down the coast and investigated all these different beaches here along the coastline down to Rodel. And to our surprise, most of them weren't too bad, actually. Obviously, areas that are more inhabited have more visitors on the beach. There's more people to pick things up casually on a walk, or maybe people scouring for plastics, looking to do things with them. For instance, a lot of people use crates to make raised beds or vegetable receptacles, or use them in their garden. And I've seen a few lovely examples of that here on Orkney while I've been there. But even the not so bad beaches have definite evidence of a lot of plastics, and these pebbles rolling over the plastics, swallowing the plastics, also under layers of sand eventually. It's particularly erosive because they harm the surface of the plastic by going over the plastic as the tide goes in and out as the storms come. They break loose little fragments of microplastics that in turn are very, very hard to remove from nature. And then things that are a little bit tricky, I wouldn't recommend picking up gloves like that when you see them for health and safety reasons mostly. And that's another issue that obviously occurs. What sorts of objects do you find and what has their past been and how harmful is it to environmental health and your own health? And even really large quantities of nets like this pose a massive challenge. How do you get them off the beach? What do you do with them when you find them? And nature has its own way of dealing with these problems. So while we were on Harris, we saw a lot of these plastics. I talked about the beach and the pebbles swallowing up the plastic slowly. But the soil also has a way of doing this. And in a way, that's one of the only ways of nature to deal with this problem, to grow over it and to absorb it into the soil. But of course, these plastics are around for hundreds and thousands of years. They don't decay naturally in the environment, other than to shed microplastic particles. But then once you've got them in the soil like this, half buried, or even this bit of rope here, they become a part of the environment. And in a way, we have altered the environment permanently through this plastic pollution, because to dig this out, to take this out of the soil again, would take a lot of effort that probably no one is willing to make. Or maybe one day we will make it, but not just yet, if we can even find it. On the beaches that I visited, there was a lot of ropes that were half buried in the sand. They're just very hard to remove. You need to actually dig them out. And the same with the larger items such as crates. And you can see really nicely the lichen growing over it and the moss and sort of the soil trying to pull it back into itself. Um, but in some locations like this one, uh, that are really only accessible by boat. So we went from Scarp with a local fisherman, and we went all the way up Loch Resort and then around this coastline here. This is where the first photos were taken that I showed you as part of this presentation. And the problem there is exactly the same. The plastic still lands, but it becomes even more inaccessible to humans, just on shorelines, beneath rocks, embedded in the mountainsides, like this little bit here, for instance. And then on some beaches, you can see layers and layers of plastics and rope that have been absorbed over the years, where the soil maybe breaks away and is eroded. They surface again. So, for instance, these layers here would have built up over decades. And in fact, the local residents, and I don't know if you have the same experience on Orkney, but the local residents told us that they've definitely had this problem or noticed this problem since the 1960s, although they were quite surprised by how the rubbish that they had seen over the years had changed. So initially in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, they were finding a lot of domestic type rubbish, earbuds and such like, cosmetic products and packaging. And they attribute that to the idea that back then New York dumped its rubbish in the sea and the current carried it all the way over there. But items that have been found and that we found have come from as far away as Brazil and much more the Caribbean, much more tropical regions. So these pieces of plastic have their own life and they can float around the oceans for decades. Um, and then in more recent years, we found out that the rubbish that was being seen was a lot more industrial rubbish, a lot more related to fishing industries and farming, but also related to cruise ships and such like. So that was quite interesting for us. And here's just another little collage of interesting items that we saw. Lots of Wellingtons. And Ian likes to tell a story that he once found a Wellington with a foot still inside it, which is a little bit gruesome. But not totally unexpected. And sometimes you can see like those milk cartons, they've actually been strung together by someone and either used as a float for something or just dumped in this way to keep them together. And of course, milk cartons are made out of a plastic that's one of the easiest types to remanufacture. So for our project, this would be ideal. Um, and so we took a selection of plastic samples. The choices we made were our guesswork of what types of plastics might these objects might be made from, but also maybe things that we thought looked quite interesting and objects that we wanted to investigate a little bit more. So this brush lake, we took them back to the lab and we had them analyzed by a plastics material scientist to see what they are. And it's actually quite interesting. There's a big database that you can access and compare the chemical composition of the plastic you're analyzing to. And so you can sometimes even determine the manufacturer in this way. So this brush-like object was made from PP, and I think it also shows you a really important aspect of this problem, this ocean plastics problem. And well, that is the colonization of marine life within these plastics and the way they retain grains of sand and other kinds of debris. So this, for instance, had a lot of debris in the stuck in the bristles, and you can just see up here a little organism that has attached itself to it. And then that's it magnified 3 times, and you can really see the scale-like effect that I was talking about earlier, where stones and rocks have hit it. UV rays really degrade plastics very quickly, actually. They're probably more harmful than the actual salt water in terms of degradation. So the plastics that are on top of the beach or that are lying very exposed to UV light become very brittle and then they flake off and become microplastics. So a huge object like this, I mean, when I say huge, it's not that huge. It's maybe 15 centimeters. So, like that, you could get millions of particles of microplastics from these types of objects over the years. And you can see the dirt here ingrained between the bristles. And the reason why that's important for our project and remanufacturing these plastics is because the more dirt you have in an object, the harder it becomes to 3D print with, because a 3D printer has a certain size of nozzle, and the standard size of that nozzle is zero point 0.4 millimeters. So anything that's larger than that clogs up your nozzle. So you have to try and remove as much of it as possible. But then, in terms of sustainability, you hit quite a difficult question because how do you take this debris off the plastics without wasting a lot of fresh water? So scrubbing a piece of plastic under a tap for 2 or 3 hours, as you might have to, is not very sustainable. So this is where sustainability becomes a really difficult thing to get a grasp on, and especially in relation to ocean plastics. That's another bit of plastic here. Again, I think this is broken off a crate, and you can see very well here the UV degradation of the plastic, the large cracks that things have gone into. And from close up, even though this doesn't look very dirty at all when you look at it with the naked eye, when you look a little bit closer, then you can see all the dirt that's kind of gone under the scaly surface of the plastics. An object made from HDPE. That was another really interesting part of the project and a really interesting finding that some plastics seem to attract marine life a lot more than others. So HDPE was particularly prone to being colonized by small organisms and lichen. And that poses more questions yet again in terms of the microbial life within the sea. What sorts of organisms are floating along with these plastics from faraway shores to our beaches? And I think that's a really interesting thing that very few people think but or talk about, because we think, oh well, if they've come from a really hot tropical location, they probably can't survive in our cold waters. But now that the warming of the oceans is becoming more of a problem, these organisms can hitchhike to other beaches and cause all sorts of potential problems on the shores that they land on. So I think that's maybe something that we'll be looking into a little bit more. But at the end of the day, I'm neither a material scientist nor a microbiologist. I'm actually a designer. So that's another object, really lovely comb-like object. I haven't been able to find all the find out what these objects used to do, but I think they're really interesting visually. You can see more microbes that have attached themselves to that. And yes, the boys, we found that they were made from polystyrene. Most of them we found were intact. This particular one wasn't. But it's quite nice because you can see the manufacturer and where it's come from. So you could, in theory, they're very, very traceable. And I picked up one just there as well from Orkney. And that's just a reference image, another beach on Harris, completely pristine, beautiful, the sort of image that you might have on a postcard, maybe only about 5 kilometers away from Scar. And so sometimes the plastics problem is really hidden to people who come to the islands. After we took the plastics back to the lab and we had some time to think about ways to remanufacture them, we extruded some 3D printing filament from them. The main thing that we do, the main thing to think about is once these plastics have been exposed to so much environmental influences, they become really, really brittle. So you have to add a little bit of virgin plastics. And what we use is these little nodules. These are actually colored. I've colored these with some pigment. But they're just little, you can actually also find these on the beach sometimes. They're just little plastic pellets of about 5 millimeter diameter. And together with shredded ocean plastic, um, you can put those into a big machine called an extruder. Not that big. I will show you in a second. This is it here. And for those of you who were at the workshop yesterday, this is the extruder we would have been using. Um, and you can just put them into this extruder. It's got a motor at the back, and then it's got a sort of melting chamber here in the middle, with a lead screw that pushes the plastics through a nozzle, and it extrudes as 3D printing filament for FDM 3D printers. And sometimes it can be quite challenging to grind up the pieces of plastics to the right size. So obviously, when I was doing this project, we had access to a massive granulator, which most people won't have. But for instance, it's really easy if you find a bit of rope, which is one of the easiest plastics to extrude in this way. You can just use a pair of scissors and just cut it off little bits to make it small enough to be a part of this process. And for me, that's really important, that it's not just a thing you do in a lab, but this is actually something you could do in a maker space. I think you have the Men in Sheds Association here on Orkney, or just even at home if you wanted to. We took the extruder, and that's the 3D printer here. into a local school in Tarbet, and we did a workshop with the children talking about the beach plastics that are on their shores, and we're using 3D printing pens for them to draw objects that they've seen on beaches, on local beaches, that are made from plastics. And you could, in theory, use the extruded plastic in these 3D printing pens as well. We also printed a map of Paris, and yesterday at the museum in Stromness, I presented them with a similar map of Orkney. So if you want to see that, that will be there on display eventually. And the idea of the geography being closely linked to the ocean plastics problem, but also to apply your local knowledge of geography to this problem is really important to me. I think it's really nice to know your surroundings really well and to be able to pinpoint beaches where these plastics can be found, so that if you want to go and collect some, you can share that knowledge with others. And so we extruded some plastics, and then we printed these tiles from the plastics that we extruded during the workshop. And there's just some of the filament we made during the workshop. And you can see sometimes the sand remains inside the plastic, but that doesn't pose a especially difficult problem as long as the grains are small enough. They just get extruded out with it. And you can get all sorts of colors. You can add pigments to them, but you can also just use the pigments that are already in the ocean plastic. And that's quite a nice way to make use of that as well. What's quite interesting about the material we extruded was that even though it had undergone some cleaning and it had been put through a machine that operates at around 200 degrees centigrade, it still retained the smell of the sea, and it does to this day. So it's 6 years later now, but when I pick up the rolls of plastic that we've made, you can still smell the sea type smell that you smell on a beach. So I really like that. That's part of the material quality of this material. We then did a workshop, and here you can see actually the plastics being extruded through the machine. And we did a workshop in Delft to show to show a group of researchers how to do it, who can in turn then um, put this knowledge into use in their local communities. You can just see this is the granulator we used, but I know that, for instance, if you use a hacksaw on smaller things like, for instance, this golf ball, which has quite a thin wall, you can also use coffee grinders at low speeds, and there are all sorts of ways. As long as you just make the bit small enough, you don't need a professional granulator. And then we also printed a series of rings because my background is as a jewelry designer. This was the project we did at this workshop, and this is the amount of the 26.8 kilogram ring, which is the amount of ocean plastic each person would have to collect to even make a dent in the problem worldwide. And that was in 2019, so I can't imagine that it's got less than that. So 30 kilos per person is probably the amount of plastic that you need to pick up yourself. And that brings us to today. So thank you very much for listening. And are there any
Perfect.
questions?
Yeah, thank you very much. We've got a microphone running. If anyone has a question, please stick your hand up and we'll get the microphone over to you.
That's the lady
There's a
over
question
there.
just at
Yeah.
the front. Does anyone have the microphone? Just down here.
Thank you. Thank you, Katharina. That was a lovely presentation. It was very interesting. I've just studied fine art. I have been fortunate to study in three UHI sites, North Uist being one of them, Orkney and Shetland. And the first thing that I would say is that I was astonished, like you, at the amount of beach plastic that I saw in Shetland.
Mhm.
I think maybe industrial waste contributed to that. But my point that I'm interested in is on in Benbecula, there's a company called Studio Vans,
Mhm.
and they are using sustainable methods to refit camper vans. And they have a recycling process, a granulator and a big heat press. And I was fortunate enough to go to a workshop
Nice.
and make some plastic
Yeah.
items in that way. And I wondered if you thought that in addition to the laser printing, that something like that is a community educational, having access to something like a granulator. I've never tried to do it in a coffee grinder, but to access something like a granulator and learn which types of plastics you can work with in an educational community way, I think would be a tremendous asset. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I absolutely agree. So there's quite a few projects around the world. For instance, the Precious Plastic Initiative that originates in the Netherlands, where they give you blueprints for the granulators and the machines you can build from scratch. The extruders as well. My first extruder was built from a kit at home. It's not a high-tech bit of kit. It's just then you need to have someone who can teach you how to use it. And I think this is where the community aspect is really, really important, because you might be an enthusiast and you might be able to access the blueprints and you might somehow get access to make the parts through a local maker space. I think there is one on Shetland. I'm not completely sure about Orkney yet, but maybe you have access to these things, but then it's a question of how do I do it? What plastics do I use? And that was part of the project, to figure out which of these plastics are usable and easily usable for people, for ordinary people to just go to a beach and use as a material resource. That's why it's a lot harder, for instance, to break up a massive fishing crate that's nearly fully intact, but maybe it's just broken in half and has a very thick type plastic, whereas the rope lends itself a lot more to just very low tech processes to make it into smaller pieces. So I absolutely agree. It would be fantastic. You can also use injection molding. That's another nice technique that you can use with the plastics. Um, but it's a little bit more elaborate in terms of needing molds and then kind of just being able to make certain types of objects with the molds that you have. But yes, absolutely, I agree. The community aspect is really, really important.
Thank you. And just while we see if anyone else has a question, I'll ask one of mine. In your work, have you encountered any everyday items, something that we use every day, that you were kind of shocked by how difficult it is to recycle?
Maybe toothbrushes. Toothbrushes have sort of the nylon bits at the front that you use for brushing your teeth, and then they've got relatively thick handles, and they do seem to get swept up quite often. I don't know why particularly, but um, obviously things like polystyrene are quite toxic when you try to remelt them, so I would not recommend that. But yes, it's things that are made from a multitude of materials that are the hardest to use in this process. Um, Trainers, I've across a lot of trainers, and Wellingtons. Wellingtons are made from rubber, so you can't do anything with those. But also shoe soles that are made from many different layers of components. They're much harder to tear apart again.
Okay. One of our questions from Slido. Is there a website or a YouTube video which takes you through the workflow of converting plastic waste into 3D printer filament?
Oh, I think that your first point of call would be the Precious Plastics website. They have a really big resource in terms of building your own machines and looking at the kind of resources that you need, and it explains a little bit about the process of then extruding it as well. I'm not aware of any particular videos. There might be some on YouTube. There's a community of making enthusiasts out there who work with just virgin plastics to extrude filament for 3D printers. And I think that would be a really good starting point, just to learn the basic process. Even with just the virgin plastics, it's something that you probably need a little bit of practice with before you can get it right and then it works. But 3D printers have got a lot better since I started this. They've got a lot more intelligent. They've got a lot more tolerant of different diameter filaments than they used to be. So I think all these things can really help you to use this process in your own studio or in your own community group.
Thank you. Any questions? Just up here.
Yeah, I regularly do beach cleans around the Stromness area, and it strikes me that it's a very good project, but the tons and tons of plastic waste that we get on the beaches, it must be a very small proportion of the stuff that's on there. So what's your suggestions for the rest of it?
It's a really difficult one. Absolutely, no, I agree. And as I said at the beginning, yes, this is only a tiny, tiny amount. You know, you don't need a lot of uh, ocean plastic to make a lot of filament. But what happens to the rest of it? Um, I think most of the time people will try and transport it to local waste recycling plants and burn it. I, I've spoken to quite a few material scientists who think that this is a great solution, but I don't agree because every time you burn plastics, no matter how high the temperature, you're destroying something that was made from a natural resource we extracted at great cost to the planet. So it's a tricky question. I think we all have to try and come up with answers to this. I don't think I can by myself.
Just one other thing. I'm a member of Greener Orkney, and we have a project that I think is about to start, where we've acquired or are in the process of acquiring a drone to survey the more remote beaches to see what they're like.
Oh wow, great! I'd be very interested to hear more about that.
Yep, just up here.
Just following on to the gentleman behind me's point, I live in Dumfries and Galloway, and along the Solway Firth, there was a project. Now, I think it was the Galloway, Southern Ayrshire and Galloway Biosphere, I believe, and they've conducted a project where they've constructed little laminated cards, like on a keyring, which have pictures and names of parts of lobster creels, for example, that if people find in beach cleans, they can then recycle
Hmm.
rather than them just going into the plastic waste. And I think there's lots of areas within that we could, if we could identify during beach cleans and find recipients who can use these parts, it's perhaps a way forward as well.
Absolutely, and even to make manufacturers take some of the responsibility for what happens to their products at the end of their lives. So, toy manufacturers, for instance, if you could return things to them in some way, that would be a good first step. But we've entered in a way a sort of post new materiality where we're realizing that we can't keep going in the way that we have been making new materials and just using new materials all the time, but that we maybe have to think about for our sakes and for the environment's sake, what we can do with the materials that we made and are already out there. It may need a third or fourth life in a way. So yeah.
Hi, I live on Rousey, which is one of our North Isles. We have a beautiful beach that is very difficult to access, and there's
Yeah.
lots of buoys and things. Very interesting. Um, but I was going to ask you a couple of things. Maybe somebody here knows what happened. I think it's in Papua, North Ronaldsay. They were doing collecting and granulating plastics. Wonder if anybody here knows how that project's going. The other one I would ask you as you as an artist, um, uh, about putting things into fabric and cloth
Hmm.
to wear. Have you ever worked in that capacity with a flexible plastic or film?
No, personally, I haven't worked in the sort of textiles area. I know there's a lot of manufacturers, even large scale manufacturers, that have used ocean plastics as part of their garments and they've respun it into fiber. I think that's a really positive way to go forward. They respin it, yeah. They use, I think, mostly fishing nets. Again, they're one of the easiest plastic to recycle. I think it gets a lot harder when you've got these more solid objects. But they respin it into new fibers and then they use that in their products, which is a really nice way of doing something with it, and maybe a much larger scale than what I'm talking about.
Just over there.
Just sort of thinking about the different types. Had you done any work to, I think, understand the quantities of the different types of plastics you've got? I mean, obviously you've got a lot of polypropylene rope there probably, but because I guess while it's interesting to prove that you can do 3D printing in reality to make a big impact, somehow or other this has got to be kind of industrialized, and then you're looking at large scale, as you say, injection molding type things that would ultimately use this. So I guess having that fundamental work of like what are the quantities of the different types that would need to be segregated, probably processed in different ways ultimately. Interested in your thoughts on that.
So yes, I mean PP, PPE, and HDPE were the plastics we found the most of, and then the boys, polystyrene. And I think even if beach cleanups could start at, I mean, HDP is very easy to recycle in this way. Milk cartons are made out of HDP, and there's a very established pipeline for recycling and repurposing milk carton plastics. Um, Even if it's the pollution I was talking about, the sand, the microorganisms, the little barnacles that attach themselves to the plastics, that is where it gets a little bit difficult, because you might be able to do a beach cleanup and you might teach people how to identify the different types of plastics and maybe separate them and have large collections for manufacturers to then take away, but they would still be full of sand and all sorts of debris that they've picked up over in the years in the ocean. And that is one of the most difficult problems to solve, actually. How do you clean it? How do you, a rope like that is full of little crevices where things accumulate inevitably. Um, and that's maybe that is where our expectations of what products should be like have to change as well, where maybe we have to re-examine our notion of what should a material look like and be like. And so maybe there is a little bit of an imperfection that used to be a grain of sand, and maybe that's now in the material that you're using, but maybe you're just using it as a foot mat in a car where it's maybe not aesthetically so important.
Okay, and we had a question at the back. Just while Eric is making his way up there, I'll ask another one of mine. You talked about in one of the slides the issue of plastic even getting lodged in between layers of soil.
Right.
Do you have any ideas on how could we tackle that? How could that plastic be extracted from the soil?
Yeah, and that's I think especially on the beaches I've seen here is one of the most difficult problems, because you've got a lot of I don't know if the beaches are dredged and the pebbles are swept to the side, which sometimes happens, or if the storms do that. I'm not familiar enough with Orkney to know that. But the layers of soil and the layers of pebbles, you would literally need to take every pebble from the top and dig for the plastic. And maybe one day we will. Maybe it will be like a sort of second gold rush, but for plastic materials. Um, but yes, that is one of the most difficult problems of the ocean plastics problem. Do we wait for nature to erode the soil and then just take the plastics out, or do we just accept that we now have layers of plastics interspersed with the soil and the pebbles and on the beaches?
Yep.
Yeah. You were saying about the uh, filament that you make for the printers.
Yeah.
It's the nozzle on the printer that's 0.4 of a millimeter, I'm guessing, because it looked like much bigger than 0.4 of a millimeter, the filaments that you were making from your extruder.
Yep.
So I'm just wondering, is there a possibility that you could just change the the filament on the printer? Sorry, I'm getting my tongue twisted here. The extruder on the printer to a bigger nozzle,
Yep.
so
So
that you could build, you won't be able to build such fine things, but you could build things that were maybe structural elements, that like you could build something the equivalent of a house brick and build the
yeah,
inside walls of a house from it.
absolutely. So domestic 3D printers, for want of a better word, come. You can now get nozzles that are up to 1.2 millimeter in diameter. When I print with the ocean plastic filament, I usually change the nozzle to 0.6 or 0.8, just to allow for more of a through flow of any kind of sand. The zero 0.4 nozzles are the standard nozzles that most 3D printers get issued with, but now there are lots of ways to change the size of the nozzles up to about 1.2 millimeters. And yes, there are larger 3D printers that can print even bigger things with bigger nozzles on a larger scale. But I think when I was talking about the 3D printers that are being used and that we were working with, I was just sort of basing that on the average 3D printer that is in someone's home potentially.
Any more questions from the audience? Oh, we've got one down there.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. Just a thought came to me. The workshop that you did with the school in, was it Tarbet?
Yeah.
Something like that. How easy would it be to roll out that kind of workshop to schools elsewhere? Yeah,
Really easy, and I had hoped to do that, but as you can see, it was in 2019, so 5 minutes before the lockdown.
Oh, yeah.
And yeah, and then the lockdown happened. So that was in autumn 2019 that we did that, and then the lockdown happened, and now I'm trying to pick up the project
Mhm.
again, and hopefully find more places where I can do these types of workshops.
Oh, brilliant. So what kind of equipment did you need? It was like, was it the extruder and
Yeah,
the
so I
granulator?
bring all that to the
Yeah.
workshop, yeah, the 3D printing pens, because it all fits in the boot of my car. And so that's my hope for the future of the project, that I can go around places with beaches, take people to the beaches to pick up plastics and teach them which plastics work really well with these kinds of processes, and then take them back to the lab, maybe have it's set up in a little van or something, and really starting to extrude things right there and then, even by the beach or in local schools, local venues.
That sounds really brilliant, actually. And is there some way in which we can just follow your progress and see how you're getting on
Yeah,
with that? And
I'll be putting a website link onto my page of the Royal College of Art, and I'll give the link to Lisa or Howie, and then yeah,
brilliant. Thanks very much.
no problem.
That was going to be one of my questions, actually. I have the name of the website here, smartjewelry.com. And yeah, can you quickly tell us about what people can find out there, how they can
Oh,
follow the
well,
work?
my blog is mostly about digital making, 3D printing, and my practice as a jewelry designer. So if you're interested in that, please come. So I use the filament that I make to make jewelry. I had an exhibition in London last year where I showed the photographs alongside the jewelry that I made from it. And it plays on this idea of these objects that we find being quite intriguing and precious, but also becoming more materially precious through making filament. So yeah, you can read about that, but you can also read about the things I did in my PhD, which was working with smart materials and making jewelry with technology inside it that reacts to the body in some way. So yeah,
Yeah.
thank you.
Any more questions from the audience? Right. Well, I think we will wrap it up here. So Dr. Catherine Bones has gladly said that she would be happy to stay and have a little informal conversation. If anyone wants to follow up on anything or ask any more questions, that would just be in the green air room just up at the top. Before we go, if you make sure to visit the museum in Stromness, was it the exhibition was
Yes,
in? Yes,
yes.
if you make sure to visit that, stop by if you get a chance. And just before you go as well, um, there are hard copies of feedback forms dotted around the theater. You can also scan the QR code that's on screen at the moment. If you leave us feedback, it really helps make sure that we make the festival better in the future and that it continues to run. And all that's left to say is thank you so much again.
And thank you all for coming and listening.
Thank you.